Good morning and welcome to the UCLA Center for India and South Asia. Before I keep going, can everyone hear me? Someone can give me a thumbs up or something to indicate that there's life out there. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. My name is Baris Venkat, and I'm a faculty member here at UCLA in the Department of History and at the Institute for Society and Genetics. The Center for India and South Asia, or CISA, supports research, hosts public lectures and workshops, and collaborates with other institutions and centers to raise the profile of South Asia on campus and more generally in Southern California, and now I guess around the world, since we can open this up to a much larger public, which is perhaps the only upside to this whole pandemic situation. Our goal is to transform UCLA into one of the leading poles of integrated research activity on India and South Asia in the country through research, collaboration, and academic integration. Our public speaker series features UCLA faculty and distinguished scholars from around the globe, serving to introduce substantive coverage of new areas. So before we get started today, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. I'm sure all of you have become Zoom experts by now, but just in case, here's a few kind of guidelines. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to our guest speaker. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. As time allows, the presenters will address as many questions as she can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We'll also be recording the webinar and we'll share the link after the event. So for those who couldn't make it, if you have friends who couldn't be here, please do send it along. So this is our first event of the year. We're quite excited to have Dr. Aditi Saraf, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at Ashoka University. Her current book project, tentatively titled Frontier Signatures, investigates the relationship between commerce and sovereignty in the Kashmir region. Combining ethnographic and archival work, her research interests revolve around questions of political economy, frontiers and mobility, militarization, and placemaking practices. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Saraf.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to speak here today, especially Bharat and Jamaica for organizing everything. It's such a privilege to share my work at the Center for South Asia. And thanks to everyone who's zoomed in as well. I have followed with pleasure the research of many of you gathered here. So without much ado, I'll just start. I'm going to share my screen. Since I have a presentation. I'm just going to briefly give a context for my research. Since this is the Center for South Asia, I don't need to go too much into detail over here, thankfully. So Jammu and Kashmir, once officially an Indian state, presently something else, although one is not yet sure of its lineaments, straddles the borders of India, Pakistan, and China in the northern Himalayas. It has been the site of intense political and territorial rivalry between India and Pakistan since 1947. Once called the world's most dangerous nuclear flashpoint, it is currently its most densely militarized region. In the Kashmir Valley, the Vale of Kashmir shaded right there, where I conducted fieldwork, a popular movement for liberation, or Azadi in Urdu, from Indian rule was launched in 1989 and resulted in more than a decade of armed militancy and brutal reprisals by the Indian state. After a ceasefire agreement in 2002, the violence abated, but Kashmir remains effectively occupied by the Indian state's armed forces that maintain control through the exercise of emergency laws. My own dissertation research was bookended by massive uprisings in the Kashmir Valley in 2010 and 2016, during which a typical state of siege holds sway. So you have mass protests, prolonged curfews, indiscriminate firings, blinding, snapping of internet and mobile services, and media blackouts. And the prolongation of this kind of siege since last August, after the Indian government stripped away Jammu and Kashmir's constitutional autonomy and bifurcated the state, as well as its multiplication on several fronts, indicates that the war in Kashmir has reached a dangerous threshold and taken on new folds. Now, the continuing violence in Kashmir betrays the limits of exclusive nationalist territorial claims in this region. I propose that such claims are in fact politically unsustainable. Scholarship on Kashmir has tended to privilege either nationalism in its major and minor forms, or religious divisions between Hindus and Muslims as the dominant motor of political conflict. In my research, I show that attention to credit and market networks across national boundaries that incorporated diverse trading diasporas provide a different mode for reading the dispute. Rather than focus on nationalism or communal tension, they shift our attention to Kashmir's history as a frontier prior to its fragmentation by competing empires and nation states. Sorry, just a moment. Right. So I want to quickly mention here that I use the term frontier in full awareness of its freighted entanglements with colonial and capitalist violence and extraction, but I continue to find it conceptually useful for tracing anxious contestations and political struggles over the longue durée, and I can talk about it a little more, address this during the discussion session in case anybody has any questions. So I will now lay out how my talk will unfold. First, through a glimpse of the colonial archive, I will briefly index the historical importance of Kashmir's past as a long frontier to indicate the complexity of political jurisdiction in this region, suggesting that questions over political control came to congeal around thinking about trade. Following that, I will show how credit-based transactions persist through the trust deficit, which is a term that traders use to describe both lack of trust in the state and also the mistrust that has permeated exchange relations within their own community. And I will conclude by signaling the relevance of the economy and the imagination of the frontier for developing alternate conceptions of community and belonging and attachments in the present. Now, let me start by presenting an excerpt from a letter sent by Henry Harding, the British Governor General of India, to a secret political committee in 1846. And I'm going to quote, "It was not my intention to take possession of this territory. Its occupation by us would be on many accounts disadvantageous. It would bring us into collision with many powerful chiefs for whose coercion a large military establishment at a great distance from our provinces and military resources would be necessary. It would more than double the extent of our present frontier in countries assailable at every point and most difficult to defend. New, distant, and conflicting interests would be created, and races of people with whom we have had hitherto no intercourse would be brought under our rule, while the territories, excepting Kashmir, are comparatively unproductive and would scarcely pay the expenses of occupation and management." This quote summarizes the picture of the mountainous frontier in the colonial imagination, but I want to emphasize the point that became central to my research, that one cannot speak of one part of the frontier without taking into account the other parts, because to speak of the frontier is to consider not one form of political jurisdiction, but many. Many chiefs, many races, many countries. The territory of the frontier is evidently non-uniform and non-unified, although it does appear to have a web-like consistency. I suggest that it is precisely the web of trade networks that connect the seemingly discrete nodes of the frontier. An important point here is that the frontier is not a place that cannot be politically governed, because there is political jurisdiction of a multiple and overlapping form. How to manage and control that form is precisely what forms the crux of Henry Harding's anxiety over here. And so the East India Company, which governed India before it officially came under the British Crown, declined to occupy the frontier and instead sold it via the Treaty of Amritsar in 1846 to their ally in the Northern Wars, a Dogra chieftain called Gulab Singh. Gulab Singh thus became the first Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, the largest of princely states under the British Indian Empire. The three primary districts of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, in addition to several other tributary districts, were in themselves ethnically and culturally distinct and had been yoked together primarily to preserve networks that sustained trade in what was then the ur commodity of the region, which is the eponymous Kashmir shawl. The eastern district of Ladakh, in fact, was annexed to secure control over the mountainous route through which wool from the highland Pashmina goats of the Changthan region in Tibet traveled to the center of shawl manufacture, the city of Srinagar in the Kashmir Valley. So after independence and partition in 1947, just kind of skipping forward 100 years, Various wars over Kashmir caused the provinces of the former princely state to be divided up into sections controlled by India, Pakistan, and China, although of course both India and Pakistan lay claims to the entire region through distinct framings. Since Kashmir has been embroiled in multiple and enduring border-making conflicts with various lines of control, the dotted lines that you see on the map, serving as the de facto political and military borders. In 1987, allegations of rigged municipal elections in Kashmir gave vent to decades of frustration with the Indian state viewed as capricious, corrupt, and coercive. Popular protests built up to an armed movement in 1989, and the years that followed also witnessed the exodus of most of Kashmir's minority Hindu population from the valley, upper caste Brahmins known as Kashmiri Pandits. Now, when I started doing fieldwork, the brutality of the counterinsurgency, the ferocity of the militancy, and the exodus of the Pandits meant that Kashmir was replete with the kind of horror stories narrativized in the anthropology of violence. And indeed, I began my own research in 2009 by following the direct effects of state violence in the human rights movement around disappeared persons. But as my own work began to interweave with the personal lives of friends and colleagues in Kashmir, my attention shifted from activist networks that had gone there to study to spaces and processes that sustained mundane exchange relations. While I was conducting preliminary fieldwork in Srinagar in the summer of 2010, the Azadi movement took on a renewed sense of urgency with massive public protests that inaugurated what many have called the new Intifada or uprising, inspired by the Palestinian struggle in Kashmir. Caught between shutdowns enforced by the protest calendars issued by pro-freedom parties and the retaliatory curfews. Here's an example of the protest calendar. And the retaliatory curfews imposed by state forces, my mundane concerns, like those of my friends and neighbors, began to revolve around where and when to get a packet of milk or a loaf of bread, bringing markets into view for the first time. And as you can see, even the protest calendars begin and end with shopping. I cut short my fieldwork that summer, but racing towards the airport before dawn, I noticed from my speeding taxi that many neighborhood markets on the way were open and bustling at 4 a.m., just before the first call for prayers. This got me curious about how the marketplace could be a productive site for thinking about political conflict and everyday life. Given strong traditions of commercial prescriptions and prohibitions in Islam, I decided to shift my research to how the Islamic moral economy that I expected to find organized bazaar commerce and consciousness in the effort to build consensus towards a Muslim political community. What I found, however, in the market practices that I subsequently observed over 22 months of fieldwork and in networks that enable the flow of goods, payments, and goods and payments during strikes, curfews, and economic blockades were the inherited forms of a very different kind of moral and political economy that drew out past geographies of the movement of people and things on the overland caravan trade that historically took place on the highlands between South and Central Asia. The long-standing intractability of the Himalayan terrain, with its cardinal points, as it were, mapped out by Harding as distance from the center, unmapped vastness, countless warlike chiefs, and generally unproductive landscape meant that state presence in any form was tenuous and contested. Rather, my cumulative research suggests that the assemblage of credit and market networks that made up what I call the trans-Himalayan trade ecumene provided political and economic coherence across the non-homogeneous frontier terrain marked by the distributed and overlapping jurisdiction of empires, kingdoms, and principalities. So here is the ecumene that I want to talk about, rendered on a map from the 19th century, viewed with Kashmir at the center, as you can see, and Kashmir connected through various mountain routes to adjacent territories in Tibet, Chinese Turkestan, or present-day Xinjiang, Kabul, Samarkand, Khotan, places in present-day Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Now, this is the geography that my research tries to index, and many of these places, as you know, have extremely thorny relations with forms of nationalism that seek to subsume them. So in studying trade practices as providing a material archive for alternate conceptions of community and belonging, I don't simply mean to recap classic assertions, Malinowski and Mauss onwards, that different exchange mechanisms determine the contours of social relations differently, though as you will see, my debts to these classics is unmistakable. I take the inquiry in a different direction. Alongside the boundary crossing tendencies of capitalism and the speed and scope of global finance, I turn to another genealogy of the relationship between commerce and sovereignty that subtends both the development of capitalism as well as the rise of the modern state. I study how the mountainous terrain, overlapping political jurisdictions, and channels of commodity exchange by diverse merchant networks comprise the conditions of possibility for relational forms of sovereignty different from that realized in the figure of the nation state. I examine the vital legacies of frontier trade across various sites of inquiry, quotidian practices of brokering and exchange, including credit, the burgeoning political activism and alliances of traders' collectives, the constitutions of categories of what is or what constitute an alienable and inalienable wealth, especially land. And finally, I explore them in the archives of highland exploration and economic regulation that show how control over the frontier territory was exerted not so much through the collection of land revenue, but through the control of movement by evolving new pathways of mobility and regimes of taxation. Through these optics, I explore how flows of people, goods, and ideas, along with the changing laws, prescriptions, and controls of the same, express tangible forms of community attachments and placemaking in this region. Now, moving to the topic of today's talk, my question in this section is, how does credit allow market transactions to continue and mercantile networks to endure in times of trust deficit caused by the political conflict? My ethnography comes from an old wholesale market or mandi in Srinagar, where goods are sold in large quantities to be retailed by others. That's what wholesale markets are all about. The mandi that I call Gol Bazaar is located in an area where everyday life is severely disrupted by the Indian occupation as well as the resistance movement, downtown Srinagar's old city. And just to give you a sense of the prevailing mood there, here are some snapshots of shop fronts and facades in the old city where such sentiments are materialized. So on the outer wall of a toilet over here, you can see "Welcome to Iqbal Market," "Welcome for safe shopping," right under which is the resistance slogan inscribed "Go India, Go Back," which is also inscribed on another wall, the kind of outer boundary of the Islamia school. Another lane kind of has Gaza Strip emblazoned across it, invoking solidarities as well as comparisons with the Israeli occupation in Palestine. And then the last billboard advertising tailoring services kind of ends with a line. I really like this billboard a lot, which basically reads, for those of you who can't read it, due to present circumstances, the garments will be at your own risk, thereby indicating that the disruptions due to the temporalities of occupation and the resistance movement that might not have, that might result in clothes not being ready, for instance, when the proprietor said they would. So this is the context in which the English term trust deficit was repeatedly invoked, a phrase that traders used to indicate the state's mishandling of the dispute. One can reel off cited statistics: approximately 80,000 lives lost, 8,000 disappeared, reports of torture, rape, and extrajudicial killings, so on and so forth. Further, infighting amongst the militant groups, the rise of masked informants called mukbirs, and the dreaded militia of renegade and surrendered militants known as Ikhwan, engaged by the state for counterinsurgency activities, were offered as evidence of the toxicity that had seeped into the armed movement itself. The use of trust deficit by traders, and they use the English term, therefore implied a critique of the occupation and also acknowledged the perfidious intimacies of political violence within their own community. At the same time, traders also insisted that the selling of high volume wholesale commodities was conducted through trust-based credit, and they used the English terms for both trust as well as credit when they spoke about it. So Gold Bazaar, that became one of my primary field sites, was established on the banks of the river Jhelum that flows through Srinagar during the early decades of the Dogra dynasty. And in this photo, you can see the general region of Gold Bazaar from across the river, which also formed the main transport for bringing goods downstream into the market over here. So the houses facing the river are the front facades. And when you kind of approach it from the streets, you actually see their backsides. While comprising many Kashmiri Muslim merchants, Gold Bazaar was dominated until the onset of militancy in 1989 by Hindu traders from the Khatri caste of the neighboring region of Punjab, who were non-indigenous to the Kashmir Valley. This was confirmed by my own perusal of old members' lists in the dusty office of the Gold Bazaar Traders Collective. Punjabi Khatris were strong participants in the trade between South and Central Asia, particularly the hundis or bills of credit, were movers of the long-distance trans-Himalayan caravan trade. That is, these hundis or chits of credit allowed traders to buy wholesale goods from elsewhere without having to carry large amounts of money on a risky highland terrain. Therefore, I was told, Gold Bazaar was an important Udhar ki mandi or credit market in Kashmir. Now, at the outset, I want to distinguish the credit relations that I look at from two other kinds of credit that feature in larger discussions on Kashmir and South Asia. First, these are different from state-imposed debt in Kashmir that entail the transfer of massive economic packages from the Indian government to the state and institutionalizes its economic dependence on the center. Second, this credit system is different from the kind of informal credit that concern issues of agrarian indebtedness in the scholarship on South Asia. Rather, here I refer to living institutions of credit between suppliers, wholesale and retail traders that organize wholesale trade in South Asia. Such forms of commercial credit that comprise interest-free loans for large purchases have also been documented in other contexts where credit, considered too risky from a corporate perspective, is extended by suppliers with conditions that are not easy to reproduce and elude legal enforcement. Its conditions, therefore, of commercial credit approximate to the general ways in which historians and anthropologists have explained trust-based transactions within kin and caste-based trading communities in South Asia. For example, the Marwaris, the Chettiars, and the Shikarpuris, who are part of the same networks often as the Punjabi Khatris. In other words, here credit is seen as extended not just to an individual, but to a member of a community. And establishing such networks of connectedness, kinship, and trust are considered prior to the establishment of horizontal mercantile credit relations. Here, I aim to nuance the assumed link between kinship and credit and any easy translation between social knowledge and the establishment of exchange relations by examining how relations of credit and trust are forged between merchants from the Hindu and Muslim communities, that is, communities that are discursively framed as primary antagonists in the Kashmir dispute. Now, as an aside, I also want to quickly mention that informal credit transactions acquire another layer of suspicion in Kashmir, where all forms of non-formal financial transactions run the risk of being conflated with hawala. That has become interchangeable in the political mainstream with terrorist finance and black money. While this is the subject of a different paper, I want to mention this briefly just to indicate the multiple levels of mistrust and risk of criminalization that these credit flows have to traverse, which is not just political divides, but also the tension between state-regulated movements of capital and older, more informal credit practices. And these tensions became particularly visible after demonetization. So now I just want to briefly outline how wholesale trade takes place in Gold Bazaar. The main commodities that are brought into the mandi and then distributed all over the Kashmir Valley are textiles, tea, dyes, and kiryana, which is the name given to non-perishables like salt, sugar, oils, and soap. The incoming supply chain imports these communities from factories outside Kashmir, and payments to suppliers is settled according to a strict schedule, with books closing at the end of the Indian financial year in April. The outgoing supply chain that I will focus on now consists of retailers and shopkeepers from all over the Kashmir Valley who have a continuous, ongoing, and varied calendar for payment, depending on the length and depth of their relationship to a particular wholesaler. It turns like the wheels of a car and keeps on turning, I was told. There are no definite rules for settlement between wholesalers and their Kashmiri clients. The deferral of payment through credit allows the smaller retailers to take as much goods as they want at a particular time, like a form of investment, I was told. I was also told that it was 10% cheaper to buy with cash, but credit was preferred for acquiring higher volumes. No interest is charged in keeping with the moral economy of a Muslim majority milieu, and no fine in case of delay. This was told to me repeatedly. Rather, the money owed guaranteed the continuity of the relationship. Now, interestingly, the money owed is never referred to as debt or qars. Instead, the term kishti, that translates to installment, is used. I could not access the intricacies of kishti calculations because conditions of payment comprised trade secrets and was strictly under the exclusive purview of the silent munshi or accountant who pored over account books. But research from Banaras in North India indicates that kishti installments often entail multiple denominations that combine the principal amount with interest. Now, regardless of how it's calculated in Gold Bazaar, perhaps as agglomerates of principal and profit rather than principal and interest, regardless of that, kishti was evidently distinguished from qars, or debt defined as time-bound enforced repayment. Rather, collecting kishti required the effort-intensive personal labor of going around, or chakkar lagana, to solicit payments. Taken together, therefore, the turning wheel and the collection rounds implied circular rather than linear entanglements of credit and remittance. That is, the system rested on the assumption that the debts would not be completely repaid before goods on credit would be taken again. Therefore, trust-based credit was credit without end. Only the failure of kishti payments was referred to by the English term bad debt, the implication being that the transaction is a transaction of credit, understood conventionally, only in its failure as bad debt. Now, that failure was dramatically foregrounded in the turbulence that followed the onset of militancy in 1989. The civil curfew continued without interruptions for months, during which time the Mandi became the site of pitched battles between local militants and state forces. Men claiming to be militants went from shop to shop collecting donations or chanda, and traders bargained with them to bring demands down. State forces conducted cordon and search operations known as crackdowns, in which men were taken away for interrogation and often tortured and killed. Some traders told me that arms seized during the crackdowns were routinely resold by double agents to various militant groups. Bank transactions were leaked and followed by additional demands for chanda or donations. The Mandi, therefore, became a site of regulation, extraction, and solidarity, both by the insurgents as well as by state agencies. My interlocutors spoke of disruption of past traditions of trade and the replacement of old traders by new. Now, the few non-Muslim Khatri traders who remained during the militancy and kept the credit cycle rolling despite the looming possibility of bad debt acquired reputation in trader speak. One of them, who I call Ajay Arora, ran a successful family business in textiles in Gol Bazaar that bore his great-grandfather's name. Now, here is a painting of the Arora patriarch that was always kept handy at the shop. All the employees of the Aroras, who coordinated the frenzied activity of everyday business and several levels of record keeping, were Muslim. Some had worked there for decades. Others were young men from the neighborhood engaged with lifting, packing, and sorting goods, and the latter often left for protests after the Friday prayers at the Jama Masjid. It runs in their blood, Rishi, Ajay Arora's son, would say in a matter-of-fact manner. So when militancy peaked in 1990, the Auroras had 9,000 bales of cloth waiting to be sold. Rishi recalls 21st January 1990, I'm sorry, just a second. Rishi recalls 21st January 1990 as a watershed moment, a day after an infamous massacre when Indian state forces gunned down scores of protesters on the Gaukadal Bridge in Srinagar. Rishi, however, remembers that date as, and I quote, the Independence Day of Romania or some such country. Now, following up on this intriguing mnemonic, I found that 21st January 1990 is a day of a massive revolt in Azerbaijan against Soviet Russia. Black January, or Black Saturday as it came to be known, marked for many the birth of the independent Azerbaijan Republic. Now, ironically, another frontier war is currently playing out. But given Kashmir's long-standing connections to Central Asia and sensitivity to the anti-Soviet tremors there, something that is elided in conversations around Kashmir today, its aftershocks apparently impelled the then dominant militant groups to suddenly advance their schedule of pro-freedom activities. The Auroras sent their female kin to Amritsar in North India, but Ajay and his brother stayed back to finish selling off stock. Once the stock ran out, the brothers decided to keep working, adapting their work culture to change circumstances. An army bunker sprang up next to their store, leading to daily exchanges of fire, and the Auroras moved their operations to their ancestral home in the back alley. Instead of redirecting their clients to the back, some other traders spread rumors that the Auroras, being Hindus, had run away, thus gaining clients at their expense. In the intervening years, the brothers were entirely dependent on their employees because lack of trust in banks meant that the infrastructure for sending or collecting credit payments became entirely personal. So cash was collected and stored in bags and brought back through winding routes to avoid both checkpoints as well as barricades set up by the security forces as well as the militants. Amid such uncertainty, Rishi claimed that it was simply relations that enabled the family to continue doing business. But if the canny neighbor strategy is any indication, these very relations were quickly unraveling under the strain of conflict. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. So an important factor in the Aurora's staying power was Ajay's personal charisma and social intimacy with the downtown Srinagar milieu. Rishi recalled that his teenage father learned Arabic by accompanying his friends to Quranic lessons in the mosque, where he occasionally also insisted on giving the call for prayers. While the Auroras were vegetarians, Ajay would enjoy eating meat with his Muslim friends. He thus combined the diligent conduct of business with the cosmopolitanism distinctive of traders working in heterogeneous social contexts, whether by joining Arabic lessons or transgressing a caste taboo by eating meat. However, as I now show, Ajay's self-differentiation in asserting his distinctive position as a Hindu member of a diverse mercantile community was crucial to improvising credit relations amid war. Rishi attributed the present success of their business to a simultaneous contraction and tightening of the community of trust. I quote, in 1989, we had a database of 5,000 customers. In the 90s, we got a filter of 1,500, but there were 1,500 of the best in Kashmir. He recalled how one of their clients came to Ajay in 1991 and insisted that he couldn't pay back his debt or his kishti because all his Hindu clients had fled. Ajay Arora asked to see the ledger and offered to cancel the defaulted amount or the bad debt left by the fleeing Hindus against his own name. The client did not pay even the reduced sum, Rishi says, and I quote, now he's the number one guy in his locality. He comes today, but he comes with cash. We never give him stuff on credit. But there were others who settled their accounts within days. One of them sent us money in the dead of night. He said, here, to clear his balance, he said, here's your money, you will have to leave. In that instant, he proved to us that he was a good man. Today, I'm working with the second generation. I don't see how much he owes. I close my eyes and give him whatever he asks for. If he says, send me your car, I will send it. End quote. Now, this rendering is charged with different forms of accounting. It combines the managerial vocabulary of databases, filters, and ratings with a deep understanding of how trust is reckoned and reconfigured in altered circumstances. Defaulting on credit was not simply the refusal to fulfill a commercial commitment. It also signaled political subjectivities produced in the armed struggle that empowered Muslims to disavow obligations that they viewed as signs of Hindu domination. Trust, therefore, had to be re-earned and reconfigured through practices of extending or ending credit. In the first case recalled by Rishi, credit relations ended, though the commercial relation continued on the basis of cash. In the second case, the client volitionally ended credit through the full settlement to allow for the possibility of a future life. In deciding to continue giving out credit despite the possibility of default, Ajay himself entered a transactional arena that was neither commercial nor legal but political. In the very different context of dispute settlement through wealth exchange in Papua New Guinea, Marilyn Strathern argues that such payments are not forms of reparation that presume a social whole that is violated and must be restored. Instead, she views each exchange as an occasion for asserting power and independence through the transactional adjustment of agonistic relations amongst different individuals. Here, Strathern conceives power as the capacity to transform value, so that transactions of payment, rather than uphold already pre-existing relations, come to redefine them reciprocally with every instance of such settlement. Similarly, for Ajay, every transaction of credit became an occasion for reciprocally redefining rather than restoring prior credit relations. In pledging himself as both Hindu and Kashmiri, Ajay challenged the polarizing language of the conflict and his identification with the aggressor state. By offering credit, he affirmed his trust in Muslim colleagues and neighbors to whom he owed the continuance of his position. However, putting at stake his intimacy with Muslim neighbors, he asserted his separation as Hindu by offering to take on and cancel against his name the bad debts left by the Kashmiri Pandits. The improvisation lay in his ability to simultaneously occupy politically risky and seemingly incommensurable positions, Kashmiri and Hindu at that time, thereby wagering himself in a transaction in perpetuity that kept eventual settlement in abeyance. The doubt generated by the conflict thus turned conventional wisdom about credit upside down, in that giving credit became precisely the means to create trust rather than trust being presupposed in the giving of credit. Now, traders described downtown Srinagar as a no-go zone in the 1990s. In contrast, the brisk routine of trade during my fieldwork years in 2012 and 2013 were deceptive. The subsiding of armed militancy did not mean that calm prevailed. Recursive forms of violence and commemoration saturated everyday temporality. Insurgent and official calendars intersected to mark time in the market in pressing ways. When one could not say how many days of work the next week or month or year would bring, deferred payment through credit enabled traders to meet the challenges entailed in synchronizing and adapting to multiple temporalities of crisis. Yet, with newly minted merchants competing with old-timers for clients and suppliers, conversations around credit networks were often tense. While old-timers exalted credit relations as a custom that had been passed down generations, newer merchants disparaged credit as creating archaic forms of clientelization that were not only incompatible with free commerce, but also suspiciously close to forms of speculation forbidden under Islam. The struggle to maintain credit networks trickled down to ordinary bazaar conversations, and I now turn briefly to such a scene. One autumn afternoon, I was buying fabric for the winter at Saeed's shop. Saeed Saab belonged to one of the old Kashmiri Muslim merchant families, and despite being a wholesaler who rarely sold individually, he had kindly offered to let me buy from his collection. While I sat there, a clean-shaven young man dressed fashionably in jeans and a waistcoat walked in. The warm welcome he received made it evident that he was not from Kashmir. Saeed pressed the young man to stay for tea. The young man declined, and Saeed asked slyly, "Why? Are you afraid of staying here?" The man laughed and said, "In our Punjab, we have a couplet. In a town, amidst new people, walk through nodding, yes, sir, yes, sir." So this is Jis Nagri Jaise Vasi, Hanji Hanji Karte Jasi, which is similar to the proverb, "In Rome, do as Romans do." Everyone laughed and Saeed nodded towards me, the other non-Kashmiri in the room, and said, "She's listening to every word." So the young man turned to me and said, don't you agree? One shouldn't make an enemy of the crocodile while swimming in the river. Nehar mein magarmach ke saath bair nahi karte. We laughed again and Said said affectionately, he has come from Panipat, which is a town in the North Indian plains. He is our big man. The young man replied, I am a humble servant. Said Sahab is a leader in the mandi. Said protested. He is a big man. He's been coming here for 15 long years, but our love affair began only in 2007. I had to chase him. He would come with supplies to 2 or 3 shops at the edge and run away. He was scared to venture deeper into the mandi. His wholesalers were reluctant to share him. I had to catch him. His stuff is very good. He makes it in his own factory. End quote. Now, much is conveyed here without explicit referencing. The narrative framing of the poaching of suppliers, a bone of contention between old traders and new, as a love affair, is one way of containing the hostility that often marks the shifting hands of trade. In bringing a romantic sensibility to bear upon commercial relations, both Saeed and his young supplier acknowledge the fraught nature of their transactions and its unpredictable unfolding by recasting them as the asymmetries of erotic desire. The proverbs that festoon the young man's responses express his trepidations about visiting the mandi amidst the political volatility of the old city. Stepping into the market, he suggests, is an adventure akin to stepping into a river teeming with crocodiles, but he leaves unclear what he fears more: spies and spooks, state agents, militants, or just the wholesalers vying with each other for suppliers and clients. By drawing me into the conversation as a fellow outsider, the young man exposed overlapping yet fleeting forms that circles of trust take in this scenario. The continuing struggle of traders to maintain trust and take care of ourselves was thus narrated through jokes and verbal jousts. Here, the inadequacy of kinship, real or fictive, for establishing and sustaining credit relations resulted in their substitution by metaphors of romantic love and adventure. For historically mobile traders working in Kashmir's capital city, confinement rather than mobility has come to become the overriding experience. This confinement also impedes the quest for proactive engagement with others and the co-production of civility, instead often breeding indifference, suspicion, and recessive social and economic relations. Despite that, traditions of informal credit not only provide recourse to networks of provisioning, but are also repurposed for coping with the temporal disruptions and the relational uncertainties of occupation. Political violence in Kashmir is writ large on the landscape, and the marketplace is no exception. It is the space within which traders reckon trust and the social world that provides a scaffolding. And in doing so, they link credit practices to the daily work of living together and getting by in a zone of occupation. Today, one could imagine the wholesale market working without deferred payment and through other financialized techniques, as well as discern the attenuation of credit practices that are at once commercial and intimate. Yet there's something to be said about the fact that conducting business through credit is not contested among traders in Gold Bazaar. This makes the disposition that I have described not merely a byproduct of trade practices, but qualities that one must inculcate in order to continue doing business as it has always been done in this place. To conclude then, let me use this to return to my larger argument. What makes the whittling away of such exchange forms, for example, through criminalization, significant is that these communities are then replaced by those fashioned by the vocabularies of religious and political separation. Trust and trust deficit become traveling concepts, displaced and extended from the language of economic rationality to government speak to everyday social life in the context of a communalized and repressive state apparatus. Maintaining credit relations thus entails singular enactments that refrain from straightforward expectations of balancing, while reforming locally grounded criteria for measuring others and being measured by them in turn. This offers up a form of resistance that is not spectacularly adversarial, but resides in a refusal to submit to norms of exchange and the binaries of licit and illicit imposed by the state. Attending to these dynamics recuperates collectivities as an important dimension of the resistance movement. collectivities not granted by dominant languages of nationalism and communal separation, but forged through alternate affiliations of living together through trade, trust building, and common goals of exchange and provisioning at the frontier. I'll stop here. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
So folks, you should be able to type your questions into the chat box, I believe. If you can't, just somehow let me know. But that should be possible. I can start you off with the question right now while we're waiting for other folks to kind of type it in, if that's okay. All right, well, thank you so much for this talk. I had two kind of questions. You can take one or the other or ignore both if you'd like. The first is, if you could speak a little bit about demonetization and the kind of wake of demonetization, how that transforms some of these networks of credit, if that's possible. And the second is, I was hoping you might write a bit on the kind of theological lineaments of some of these concepts around installment debt, so on and so forth. And I know because you're moving between, sometimes these terms move into English, but I'm wondering if there is a way to think about these in a kind of deeper theological context.
Okay, so I'll actually start with the second question because it kind of connects to the first. Now, like looking back on my fieldwork experience, I think there was a deliberate reason that traders kept away from vernacular names for credit arrangements in order to kind of avoid association with putatively suspicious forms of exchanges. So in other parts of Northwest India, like hawala rather than hundi was a fairly common way of describing credit practices, which just means to pay, basically. But I think there's a reason that traders avoided any kind of vernacular terms and therefore used the English words like credit or the anodyne Hindi word udhar that roughly translates to borrow. With demonetization, basically what happened is that the criminalization of such networks became very explicit, and this was reflected in many Kashmiri traders who were put under interrogation and also then arrested for hawala transactions. Now, often these hawala transactions are basically boundary crossing credit relations. And what makes them criminal is not the fact that they're funding criminal activities, but that they cross, communities as well as spaces that nation states want to keep separate. And the interesting thing is that, in the narratives of the traders who were arrested after demonetization, many of them said that, and many of them were traders who were engaged in Indo-Pak trade, say, for instance, but they said that, politicians often got in touch with them in order to facilitate diplomatic access to the other side. But at the same time, it became very easy to criminalize these very connections that the state trespassed on in order, for reasons of political expediency. So the interesting thing about hawala accusations in Kashmir is that they're often unreliable because and these hawala accusations, of course, proliferated after demonetization, both in Kashmir as well as in India. After demonetization, but they basically name any kind of non-formal financial transaction, and not necessarily what they fund, but just the fact of them kind of slipping out of these boundaries of regulatory formal finance. I hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah.
Great. And our next question is from Purnima, who I'm going to try to unmute now, if that's possible.
Hi, Aditi. Thank you so much for such an empirically and analytically rich talk. I first a really quick comment and then a question. I really appreciated your very kind of rich and nuanced tracking of the kind of tightrope that a lot of your informants had to walk. They're very sort of adept and deft negotiation of, on the one hand, refusing the terms of engagement that the state has, forced down their growths, and at the same time, finding a way to keep working and to keep interacting. So stemming from that, I have a question that that's, I guess, more conceptual. One is, I'm wondering how you would situate your analysis with work that was coming out. I'm trying to think, maybe like in the late 90s, around, especially in political science, around social capital as to kind of engage what was then called the specter of communalism in India. So, and so there was that kind of whole body of literature. But I'm also thinking of the work of Veena Das, especially her work around with informants who were in the resettlement colonies in Delhi, and her insistence that it's in the kind of quotidian practices of everyday life that people are able to stitch back together a kind of social fabric that has been torn into smithereens. And I'm wondering if you could maybe situate your work and your kind of theoretical framework vis-a-vis her insistence on, the kind of, obligation, right? The fact that a woman who's been traumatized by what happened in the 1984 pogroms still has to cook, still has to do, wash the clothes. So that kind of obligation of keeping up with everyday life on the one hand, and the more kind of political sciencey conception of social capital on the other.
So thank you so much for that question. And you've actually pointed to where I actually, so Veena Das was on my dissertation committee, as was Jane Gaia. So my work in some ways kind of falls between these anthropological studies of exchange and value and the anthropology of violence. So from Jane, I got this very clarifying kind of conceptual framework that helped me talk about, the relegated forms of exchange that kind of leave their legacies on the frontier and that criminalize these basically what become then, cross-border hawala exchanges. And from Veena, of course, I learned how to be attentive to, so during the 1990s, many traders left, not just Hindu traders, but also Muslim traders. These are, I should mention that my interlocutors in Gold Bazaar were relatively well positioned and wholesale trade remained lucrative, but those who could afford to take their businesses outside Kashmir did so. But those who did stay back, like Ajay Arora, for them it meant inhabiting the scene of violence and the scene of betrayal and re-engaging and re-engaging with the lives and often lies of the others around them. So this is not really a triumphant story of overcoming the trust deficit and, imagining fantastic financial futures. But what does it mean to think about the mundane reparative work that goes on in spaces of everyday exchange like the market? And this is true not just in Kashmir, but also in other scenes of devastating violence where everyday life still has to somehow continue. So this is some of the questions that I definitely took into the marketplace, and something that the marketplace still struggles with and that have become more intensified in some ways after 2016 and after 2019. The mood of the marketplace has changed. So this is work in progress, the work of reparation and the work of dealing with this kind of violence. Thank you.
Hi, Aditi. So Mike, thank you for the talk. That was really wonderful. I had two questions. One was that I wanted to hear more about the background of the traders and about their class position, about their, location and other kinds of social hierarchies, and just to get a sense of how their background differed from the other people. And so I didn't get enough of a sense of, who these people were and just in terms of their social location. And my other question had to do with the role of the bureaucrats who were responsible for managing the market, for extracting taxes from the traders and so forth, and what those relations looked like especially when you put them side by side with the kinds of extraction that was being done by the militants and the forces, like, so where does the regular routine process of taxation fit in with other forms of extraction?
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question and for giving me the chance to kind of expand on these questions. So the background of, so in Gold Bazaar, which is just one of my field sites, the other was Lal Chowk, the other primary field site, which is the more central retail market. But Gold Bazaar was located in downtown Srinagar and was the old mandi. So all the traders I spoke to, actually, I should mention, whether in Lal Chowk or in Gold Bazaar, or what I call Gold Bazaar, were richer, better positioned, socially respectable traders, because they were also the only shops where I, as an unknown, younger stranger woman, could sit without them being reputationally blemished by it. So my own interactions in the bazaar in some ways were kind of limited by class and gender norms. And therefore I did hang out with older, more established traders that I could be like a daughter to. Having said that, what was interesting about these two spaces, that downtown Srinagar, downtown Mandi was very differently positioned from Lal Chowk, which was like more central, more kind of mediatically visible, the protests and everything, close to the bureaucracy, the state secretariat and everything. Whereas downtown Mandi kind of was imbricated in a much more autonomous milieu of the old city and had affiliations with the Jama Masjid and kind of fell under the purview of the Mirwais over there. So these are traders who, for instance, in their relationship with politicians and bureaucrats, whenever they went to ask them for something, they were often told, well, you guys don't come out to vote. Because it's true that they were kind of loyal to Hurriyat ends kind of proclamations of like not going out to vote in elections that they consider illegitimate, right? As far as tax collection is concerned, so that's the other interesting question about informal credit, right? Is that it is a way of evading tax, not just in Kashmir, but everywhere in South Asia, right? I mean, Barbara Harris-White talks about how tax evasion is a form of state subsidy that has been given to wholesale trade, and that has been destroyed precisely by the kind of developments that have followed demonetization and the imposition of GST, and thereby in some ways destroying the informal economy that pretty much powered these kinds of exchanges, not just in Kashmir, but in all of South Asia. In Kashmir, of course, it acquires an added layer of legitimacy. And in some ways, traders in downtown Srinagar often spoke of a parallel economy that is feeding people here. But at the same time, they also complained that the state has the ability to take taxes, but how do traders get money back that is owed to them, thereby kind of contesting the ideas, stereotypes of traders being tax evaders by saying, oh, we do pay taxes, but the state really is only good at enforcing tax collection, but not at kind of, doing anything else to help us. So these were not things that were clear. I never saw a bureaucrat in the space of the downtown Mandi. In fact, even bunkers, soldiers were much less visible in the downtown areas than in Lal Chowk. But these were the ways in which these kinds of relations and these kinds of negotiations were obliquely mentioned. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. So our next question is from Durba. Let me see if I can figure out this.
Yes, you can hear me. Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Durga. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for this extremely thoughtful talk. And I really appreciate the longue durée way of thinking about the movement of goods and that framework of indebtedness, but credit as a way to frame the regional definition of the space as well as the contemporary moment. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, at the end you go to the concept of kinship, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about fraternity. In part because I'm thinking about the SOSs that, the ads that were being reported on in February, I think in March, about in most recently, where business leaders in Kashmir were saying that we have a fraternity of men, that the failure or the failure of communications in contemporary Kashmir is preventing us to have our fraternity. And you spoke about that collaborative imagination. I'm thinking here also about the parallel economy of feeding, but how does fraternity fit in here?
Thank you so much. That's such a great question. And basically gives me a chance. So what's really interesting about the traders collectives is that every marketplace has one. Everybody has a Bazaar committee. They are all voted for. They kind of regulate the space of the market, the opening hours, the closing hours. They also organize political mobilization. So of course they kind of respond to the kind of protest calendars that are showed, but they also kind of issue their own calls for hartal around various political and economic demands, right? As the fraternity of traders do. Now that ecology of the traders collectives is very interesting. It's often, so it's tiered. There's, KTMF, the Kashmir Traders and Manufacturers Federation, the Kashmir Economic Alliance, then there's the Chambers of Commerce, then there's the industries, KCCI, Commerce and Industry, and they kind of joke amongst themselves. This is the House of Lords, we are the House of the KTMF is the House of Commons, the Chambers is the House of Lords. But when it comes to kind of in some ways protecting their economic demands, and the other interesting thing is that they also have very strong alliances with Traders Collective across the line of control in Azad Jammu Kashmir. So often during, for example, economic blockades within Jammu and Kashmir, like around the Amarnath land dispute, when apparently the Kashmir chambers and the Jammu chambers like fought so badly that they refused to speak to each other, those conversations were only mediated after the arrival of a trade delegation from Azad Jammu Kashmir that then forced all of them to sit together and talk and kind of, so there are very interesting ways in which there is a fraternity. I really like that word because it also kind of reminds me of, the Ummah as a fraternity, one fraternity under God, but they actually never use it in a theological way, but they call themselves as civil society. And again, they use the English word. So there are ways in which like the traders collectives consciously kind of move themselves both from the kind of languages of political Islam, even though they are very much practicing Muslims and have like, posters of Iqbal and all in their shops, as well as the state. So they're like, everywhere else you'll see businesses and the states are, like they come together, but in Kashmir is different. So they kind of keep critical distance from both these aspects, but they do talk about themselves as a civil society. And of course there are fights and rivalries and things like that, but it's really quite an interesting ecology. So there's no wonder in some ways that when 370 was mutilated, many traders got arrested because business leaders do become very important community leaders and negotiators in some ways. And their demands often align very closely with demands for self-determination, for political self-determination. So this question of economic and political sovereignty being entangled in Kashmir, both in the present as well as over the long durée, becomes a really interesting kind of field to explore.
Absolutely.
I hope that answers it.
It's really striking because I'm realizing I'm recently doing work around women's unionization in the cooperative. It seems to me that you're also telling the story of the rise of the cooperative or the idea of the collective or cooperative as a kind of political formation, which looks very different than the way we think of political formations in the Kashmir region. You know what I mean? So I think it's really, yeah. And then of course, Purnima's question, which is of course, I think an important gender question around the structure of kinship as being entirely male and a kind of circulation of obviously gift and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I didn't even go into like it's a very male dominated space and that comes with its own challenges. Like there were some things I couldn't do, like I would not hang out with traders over tea and cigarettes, right? But therefore I could also turn my attention to other aspects, like for example, paperwork, banal paperwork that I had collected. It also means that I was limited in my interactions. I could not like kind of hang out too much with, the young men that I speak about who would do like the labor work and the apprenticeship work in these markets. So I had to kind of spread wide, but this question of the rise of cooperatives is super interesting. And I have another chapter in my book manuscript where I look at the traders' hartal as a form of political mobilization and alliance building. But again, I mean, Durba, in your book, you have a very nice account of how kind of these sexual categories are written into history. So one of the parallel ways of like kind of working through these kinds of alliances and networks is to also think about how frontiers are written into history and how those networks need to be in some ways redirected, cut, realigned, pasted together over and over. So the nature of political mobilization keeps changing, but the role of these collectivities does not disappear in some ways over the long durée. So that actually is something that's really interesting, and I am kind of struggling to conceptualize in the course of the book project.
Great. So next we have William.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
No, thank you so much for the talk. It's really quite exciting. And I think the question I had, I mean, one thing that for me was quite exciting is both like the kind of methodological promise of the framing, as well as some of the moves that are made in the talk. So I guess I had a kind of question about, I mean, if there's this question of sort of with this invocation of Das or others, or just general questions of like the everyday kind of managing and this association of violence with a kind of sense of crisis. Mm-hmm. Something that struck me as very interesting was the kind of way you're navigating the question of like legitimation and licitness. Mm-hmm. It's not just like licit versus illicit and how, you know, like that kind of duality, but a much more textured and kind of complex engagement with that. And I was just wondering, I mean, it's more speculative perhaps, so you can take it as you like, but like if you could say something more about how you see that kind of question, both in what you are doing, but beyond it, because it seems also it has some quite important implications just for economic anthropology in general, I thought.
Thank you, William. Now the question of what is licit and illicit in the borderlands has been taken up by several scholars working in the borderlands, right? Like William Van Chandel and E.T. Abraham has this whole question of what is legitimate, what is legal versus what is licit, what is forbidden, legally forbidden, but socially sanctioned, and vice versa, what is socially not sanctioned but legally allowed. And they look at these various layers. What's interesting to me, so all this is, you can see these kind of textured you can see these layers everywhere in Kashmir, but what became kind of very striking or very important for me is that the way the state steps into this in order to create, well, I call them regulatory artifacts that kind of suspend like the ordinary workings of trade in order to create new forms of licit and illicit. So I'm thinking right now of like cross LOC exchange, right, which was supposed to happen through barter, never through monetized exchange, right? But the barter was supposed to be limited to produce, to kind of primary produce on each side of the line of control, which was basically similar. So what's the point of barter? And then, non-local produce started entering the mix, and, bananas and coconuts that came from outside Kashmir became the hotly contested produce rather than guns and arms, which, showed up only now and then. So the interesting ways in which just kind of suspending the ordinary workings of trade and alliances and networks and the way market mechanisms would work anywhere in order to kind of harness them to national projects of boundary making and separations and alliances and these fictions of separation and, kind of communities become, I mean, those kind of steps are what become interesting to me, but I can only kind of describe them on a case-by-case basis. So the way that they kind of unfold in cross-LOC trade becomes really interesting. The way that they unfold during in the criminalization of informal credit becomes interesting in different ways, so on and so forth. And now, of course, with the removal of land rights and making land kind of alienable commodity again, supposedly, it kind of opens up another kind of series of questions on what does it mean to have these kinds of extractive steps being taken in relation to kind of ecological and inalienable resources that were previously fiercely protected and deeply entangled with, ideas of sovereignty in Kashmir. So water, land, all of this kind of plays in different ways. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Great. I think Anand has a question.
Hi, thanks, Aditi. That was a wonderful talk. Very rich. There's lots that I'll be thinking about for a while. I wanted to ask about this way that you're reframing the relationship between credit and social relations, especially social relations of trust, so that credit doesn't presuppose trust, but it's productive of trust and social relations. But I was wondering, I mean, thinking about the example of the I guess, is it 92, the traders, this is Aurora who you focus on. He needs to protect himself against the perception that he's an exploitative Hindu, that I guess is widespread, which suggests that there have been failures of social relations through credit as well. So I'm wondering, when and how does credit come to produce trust, and when does it do the opposite? And when do these social relations break down via credit?
So thank you so much. So the interesting thing about trust, and that, which is why I like kind of refrain from defining what trust is, and prefer to trace like what it does in these constant invocation. Like, it is pretty much, it's a truth universally acknowledged that trust is in a state of constant deficit and damage and just insufficient, right? So what became interesting for me in the way that I formulated this fieldwork or the story of the Auroras is then how then do traders insist that they kind of operate through trust-based credit when at the same time they say that trust is damaged, trust is at a deficit, and trust is and always insufficient. It says something larger about what it means to trust, of course, but that leap of faith becomes just so much more daunting in this scenario of just like war and violence and occupation and this mutual sense of betrayal, particularly between the Hindus and the Muslim communities. And of course, the Khatris are not the Pandits, they are non-indigenous, many of them leave, those who stay back. And this is something that also has a longer history, right? Because the surprise of finding these Hindu traders in downtown Srinagar was also compounded, which is a very volatile part of this, politically volatile part of the city, was compounded by the surprise of being told that they've been there, they dominated trade and were there in even larger numbers before 1989. So again, this kind of harks back to certain networks of provisioning and certain forms of regulation, and this form of highly regulated trade in some ways that the princely Darbar maintained. I think by the sense I get is by inviting traders with very strong credit networks in the Trans-Himalayas and asking them to set up this wholesale market, right? And of course, there's stories about individual traders and, all kinds of myths and legends. It's all very fun. I mean, there are lots of stories to be told about them. And then, one of them gets killed and then the whole family moves out. And I spent a lot of time trying to trace old Khatri families that moved to Delhi and all without much success whatsoever, and kind of ended up at these kind of deaths, like they were really old and many of them were just almost dying, right? But I mean, that's all that I really want to say about trust, is to show that how it kind of indexes the insufficient conditions of its own fulfillment, but yet remains the basis on which commercial relations are kind of measured and remain ongoing. And one of the things about demonetization is that it clearly kind of obstructs and puts an end to many of these negotiations that otherwise happen at the social level. And I haven't really been able to get a sense of much, because people are already quite reticent about these relations and about these transactions. And after demonetization, they've only become more reticent about them. So that's what.
you.
Thank you. I'm realizing it's almost midnight in Delhi, so I'm apologizing for keeping you up so late, but we have a couple of other questions if you still have the energy for it.
I'm okay if
Okay.
others are okay. Yeah, if you have time. Yeah.
I think Purnima had a follow-up. Purnima, do you want to ask directly or should I read it out loud? Okay, I'll go ahead and read it then. So Purnima writes, I was looking for was more the analytic theoretical implications of your being allowed into these male-dominated spaces. So what sorts of analytic or theoretical interventions did they enable or I guess disable? And how did this shape your work?
So this is a methodological question, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that to all graduate students who are in the department, yeah, hi, Purnima. Is someone trying to say something? Okay.
I think was that Purnima?
Yes, I'm sorry, my dog is going crazy. No, I just wanted to interrupt and say, no, it's not a methodological question at all. On the contrary, it's more about, given that it's more an analytical question. It's not a methodological question. It's not about how you sort of, or it's not just about how you assume these particular kinds of subject positions. It's about what happened, given that you have to assume these subject positions, what kind of analyses did it enable? Right? So it's more a question of epistemology. It's more about the kinds of knowledge productions that were made possible by the positions you inhabited. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't misunderstood.
No, thank you. I do want to say that in some ways the conceptual and the methodological were definitely interrelated because my subject position did kind of constrain what I was able to do and not able to do. This is not just because of gender and class norms, but also because of just the severe disruptions, like, traders' work. I'm bringing nothing to the table. I'm not buying from them. I'm not helping them with their business. I don't know their business. So in some ways, just the waiting and watching and how to wait and watch at what points, how much time to spend at the shop. There was something as being there too much. There was, so how to kind of plot the frequency of how much time I spent at each of them. But what it did kind of force me to do was to kind of work in the very classic anthropological kind of mode of the bricolayer, right? Like I just learned to say very early that instead of asking more focused question, I just learned to say that I'm here to learn about trade or tijarat, and I'm studying tijarat, and then kind of seeing what kind of responses that word would provoke and what directions it would take me. And it took me in many interesting directions of memory, of history, of stories, of personal narratives, of travel accounts, so on and so forth. But it also meant that I just spent a lot of time at the archives when traders got busy or when things got dull. I would just kind of ask to see, I would go to the presidents of the Bazaar committee and ask them if I could look at paperwork that had collected in their offices and go through that. I read up a lot. I mean, there was a lot of conversation about cross-LOC trade. I read up a lot on that, read a lot of reports. So it basically meant that I had to constantly improvise and kind of, rather than aim to go deeper and deeper, because I was trying to be as unobtrusive and as respectful as possible, I learned to spread wider and wider and be attentive to relations between what people said, what they did, what were the institutions, what were the structures, what were these tiers of the traders collectives, what is it that they mobilized around, what is it they did. I attended meetings. I tried to attend meetings also between the traders and the police, but I couldn't get access to that. So it was all of that. And then, of course, after 2 years of field work, it's only when I went to the archives and I spent a month at the India office archive, just kind of omnivorously devouring files under Kashmir, that I realized that all these fragments that I was noticing that were not making sense were fragments of these frontier networks of trade that the colonials were obsessed with, kind of. And of course, you can see that in, novels like Kim, for instance. But reading that material against the grain became really interesting in in tracking how and where trade networks, economic regulations were entangled with ideas of sovereign control and, just kind of safeguarding the frontier and safeguarding it only through these multiple forms of jurisdiction and overlapping spatialities. So in some ways, it's the story of a great game, but told in a different way as well. That became an important part of it as well. And of course, the interesting thing was that they leave material and political traces that are very vital in the presence, in how the resistance movement is organized, in how it's provisioned, and in how it carries on conversations with people on other sides of the border, not just in Azad Jammu Kashmir, but also in other parts of Central Asia and the Trans-Himalayas. Thank you.
So I think the last question is from Akhil.
I think I got cut off. Hello?
Yeah, hi.
Oh, okay. So I can't see anything on my screen anymore. Okay. So my question really, I wanted to just push you a little more on the trust deficit question and ask you, how is the trust deficit here different from what exists in other capitalist markets where, it's because of a trust deficit that you have something like legal agreements, contracts. The whole theory of contracts is built around the trust deficit, right? And even in capitalist markets, people will say that even in the West, that trade exchange contracts actually work by trust, and the legal stuff is just something you fall back on in extreme circumstances, but otherwise things would never work if it were. And this has been modeled in various ways by people in economics through repeated games and the logic of repeated games and so forth.
Yes.
And Bourdieu says a lot about this in social transactions, right? That it's the repetition with a difference that makes for social life, that makes social life possible. So my question is really, what is the specific implications of this kind of trust deficit on the way in which these social relations function that is different from what would happen in other circumstances?
No, I mean, at one level, I'm perfectly in agreement with you. And this is something that I also argue, that these kinds of questions also throw into question our assumptions about how quote unquote normal markets work, right? I did do a little bit of reading around game theoretical engagements with trust. And all of it was about managing about the management of future uncertainties, right? But I guess what I would only want to say that what's kind of distinctive about the Kashmir scenario is the uncertainty in the present. And while militancy was ongoing, just the complete breakdown of any kind of social or regulatory framework, formal or informal, that kind of would enable a certain sense of forecast in the past. But so in some ways, the trust deficit in Kashmir, and of course, I have much to say about how the state uses that term versus how the traders use it, versus what does it say about trust and about the ingress of managerial vocabulary into statecraft. But I think what is interesting about the trust deficit in Kashmir is how it's kind of thrown back onto the present, rather than in some ways about managing the future. It's the present itself that becomes so uncertain that in some ways the temporal stretch, which is something that Bourdieu talks about as well. He says that the temporal stretch becomes the space where you do the kind of negotiations and power alignments that enable you to acquire the social capital that is required. That becomes really narrow for making certain decisions. But that's about all. I mean, it's the war, it's the indeterminacy of war and occupation and the resistance movement. And in some ways, there's no taking for granted what quote unquote makes trust work or possible in other markets, whether in Delhi or in kind of Amritsar or anywhere else. So in some ways, yeah, I mean, who's to say what does trust look like in normal markets as well? I still don't know what trust looks like in Kashmir, but all I'm doing is these are kind of operations where people kind of name it through which it is invoked. So that's what, yeah.
Well, great. We're now hitting 11:30 over here on the West Coast, and I think midnight in Delhi. Thank you so much for enduring through all of this.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came here today, and to Dr. Saraf for this amazing talk and for talking us through this question of trust deficit, and taking all of these questions. Please to join us again. I think in a couple of weeks, we'll have our next talk through CISA. And again, you can register through these links, and so you can get a link so you know you can come into the room and put in your password. Great. So yeah, thank you all again, and we look forward to.
Thank you so much. No, this was really fun, and it was a real privilege to share my work here. Thank you. Thank you, Bharat. Thank you, Akhil. Thank you, Jamaica.
Give a round of applause somehow virtually, you know.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.